The coffee cup shattered against the marble floor of Ashworth Tower, and every head in the lobby turned toward the sound, but it was the woman's voice that truly silenced the room. "Get this beggar out of my building before I have security drag him out by his collar," snapped Vivienne Ashworth, heiress to the Ashworth Corporation, glaring down at the man kneeling to pick up the shattered porcelain pieces he hadn't even touched. His name was Daniel Reyes, and 3 seconds earlier he had simply been walking past her with his 6-year-old daughter's hand in his, on his way to a job interview that could change their lives. Now half the lobby was staring at him like he was something dirty tracked in on someone's shoe. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that people are never truly defined by the worst moment of their lives, take a second right now and hit like, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope to. Daniel hadn't meant to bump into anyone. He'd been distracted, glancing down every few seconds to make sure his daughter Mia's small hand was still wrapped around his, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as they hurried through the polished lobby of the city's most powerful company. He was wearing his only good shirt, ironed that morning on a cutting board because he didn't own an iron anymore, and his shoes were polished with a rag until they gleamed despite the cracks along the soles. He had exactly $43 in his bank account, a landlord threatening eviction by the end of the month, and a job interview scheduled for 9 a.m. that he'd been preparing for like his life depended on it, because in many ways, it did. Vivienne Ashworth didn't know any of that. All she saw was a disheveled-looking man who'd nearly knocked into her, spilling coffee onto her $3,000 coat, and in that instant, years of privilege and a heart hardened by boardrooms and betrayal spoke louder than any decency she might have had. "People like you shouldn't even be allowed through the front doors," she said coldly, loud enough that Mia looked up with wide, frightened eyes, clutching her father's leg. Daniel didn't argue. He simply apologized, took his daughter's hand, and walked to the elevator, his jaw tight, his eyes stinging with a humiliation he refused to let his little girl see. What Vivienne didn't know, as she stormed toward the executive elevator to attend the most important board meeting of her career, was that the man she just humiliated was about to walk into the very same building for an interview, for a maintenance supervisor position in the same company she now ran since her father's passing 8 months earlier. And she certainly didn't know that fate, cruel and poetic as it often is, had already set something in motion that would unravel everything she believed about herself. The interview went as well as it could, given that Daniel's hands hadn't stopped trembling with quiet rage and shame. The hiring manager, an older man named Gregory Hale, seemed sympathetic, promising to be in touch, though Daniel had heard that phrase enough times in the past year to know what it usually meant. He walked out of the building holding Mia's hand again, and this time, when they passed through the lobby, Vivienne was nowhere in sight, already 3 floors up, arguing with the board about quarterly losses and legacy decisions her late father had made that she didn't understand or agree with. That evening, back in their cramped 1-bedroom apartment where the heater rattled like an old man's cough and the refrigerator hummed louder than the television, Daniel sat at the small kitchen table sorting through a box of his late wife's belongings, something he'd been putting off for over a year since the accident that took her from them. Mia was already asleep, and in the quiet, Daniel finally allowed himself to grieve, not just for his wife, but for the man he used to be, before poverty and loss had worn him down to someone strangers could humiliate without consequence. Meanwhile, across the city, in a penthouse office overlooking lights that shimmered like scattered stars, Vivienne sat alone long after the board meeting ended, staring at a leather-bound photo album she'd found while going through her late father's private study, a room she hadn't touched since his funeral. Theodore Ashworth had been a hard man, cold in business and colder at home, a father who rarely smiled, rarely laughed, and rarely spoke of anything beyond profit margins and expansion strategies. Vivienne had grown up starving for his approval, mistaking his discipline for love, and somewhere along the way, she had become just like him, sharp-edged, guarded, incapable of warmth even when warmth was standing right in front of her. As she flipped through the album, most of the photographs showed her father exactly as she remembered him, stern-faced, unsmiling, standing rigidly beside business partners and family members alike. But one photograph, tucked near the back, stopped her cold. In it, her father, young, maybe in his 30s, decades before she was born, stood laughing, genuinely, joyfully laughing, his arm around a young man in a worn jacket, both of them covered in dust and grime, clearly having just finished some kind of manual labor. Behind them stood a modest house under construction, and scrawled on the back of the photograph in her father's youthful handwriting were the words, "The day Daniel Reyes Sr. saved my life. I'll never forget it." Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. Daniel Reyes. The same name from the interview file Gregory Hale had left on her desk for final executive approval, the maintenance position that required her signature. The man she had humiliated in the lobby that very morning. She spent the entire night researching, piecing together fragments of a story her father had never shared with her. Decades ago, before Ashworth Corporation became the empire it was today, Theodore Ashworth had been a young engineer working construction sites to fund his fledgling business, and during one near-fatal accident on a scaffolding collapse, a fellow laborer named Daniel Reyes Sr. had risked his own life to pull him from the wreckage, suffering a permanent leg injury in the process that ended his own career. Theodore had promised, in the quiet gratitude of a man who rarely showed emotion, that he would never forget the debt he owed that family. But somewhere between the promise and the decades of empire building, life had gotten in the way, and Daniel Reyes Sr. had grown old and passed away in obscurity. His son Daniel Reyes Jr., the very man Vivienne had mocked, left to carry forward a legacy of hardship that should have ended in gratitude, not struggle. The realization hit Vivienne like a physical blow. The man she had humiliated in front of an entire lobby, the man she'd called a beggar, was the son of the only person who had ever made her father smile like that, truly, unguardedly smile, in a way Vivienne herself had never once witnessed in 26 years of being his daughter. The next morning, Vivienne didn't send an assistant or a formal letter. She drove herself, alone, without security or announcement, to the address listed on Daniel's application, her hands trembling on the steering wheel in a way they never did during million-dollar negotiations. When Daniel opened the door, confusion and wariness crossing his tired face, Vivienne felt something inside her crack open, shame, yes, but also a strange, aching gratitude, as though she were finally. She apologized, not with the polished, hollow words of a public relations statement, but with raw, unguarded honesty, telling him everything, about the photograph, about his father's sacrifice, about the debt her family had owed for over 30 years and never repaid. Daniel listened in stunned silence, memories of his own father's quiet limp, his old stories about the tower job that changed everything, suddenly rearranging themselves into a truth he'd never fully understood. What followed over the next several months rewrote both of their lives. Vivienne didn't just offer Daniel the maintenance position, she established a foundation in her father's name to support families of workers who had sacrificed for others, appointing Daniel, despite his humble background, to help lead it, recognizing in him the same integrity his father had shown decades before. Mia started at a new school with a backpack that wasn't held together with tape, and for the first time in years, Daniel slept without the crushing weight of unpaid bills pressing on his chest. And Vivienne, for the first time in her adult life, understood what her father's rare, hidden smile had truly meant, not weakness, but the memory of one honest man who never asked for anything in return. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that kindness can rewrite the past and second chances can heal what pride once broke, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with someone who might need this story today. And before we close this chapter, if you're still here with us, drop a comment below with just the word "grateful." Let's fill this space with people who still believe in redemption. Months later, on a quiet evening when the city lights blinked on one by one like something almost holy, Vivienne stood on her balcony holding that old photograph, and for the first time since her father's funeral, she smiled the exact same unguarded smile he once wore in that faded picture, because sometimes the people we wrong become the very ones who teach us how to become whole.